Yeah, let me just introduce you.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So, namaskar to one and all, and very warm namaskar to Professor Sharada Srinivasan, our today's speaker. So, Professor Sharada Srinivasan is a professor at the National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bengaluru. She received Padma Shri, the fourth highest civilian award from Government of India last year in archaeology in 2019. She has made pioneer contributions to the study of archaeology and history of art from the perspective of exploring engineering applications in these disciplines. Professor Sharda Srinivasan's landmark contribution include archaeometric characterization of bronzes of South India using lead isotope analysis and archaeometallurgical studies on ancient mining and metallurgy in southern India. These span studies on the production mechanism of high carbon wood steel and documentation of artisanal technologies such as Arnamula, height in bronze mirror making, bronze casting at Swami Malai, and ancient and continuing traditions of height in bronze working. While she has worked on artifacts in the Government Museum Chennai, British Museum, Victoria and Albert Museum London, ASI, and so on. Professor Sharada Srinivasan is a fellow of the Royal Asiatic Society of Great Britain and World Academy of Art and Science. Her awards include the Dr. Kalpana Chawla Young Women Scientist Award for 2011, the Indian Institute of Metals Certificate of Excellence 2007, and Material Research Society of India Medal 2006, the Malti D. Nagar Anthroarchaeological Award 2005, and the DST SERC Young Scientist Fellowship, the Finders Petrie Medal 1989 from University of London, the Materials Research Society Graduate Student Award 1996, the DST Nurture Scheme and Young Scientist Award, and the British Chevening Scholarship for her PhD work. She has been a Forbes Research Associate at the Department of Scientific Research and Conservation, Free Gallery of Art, Smithsonian Institution, USA in 1999, and Homi Bhabha Fellow at Indian Institute of Science, Bengaluru from 1996 to 98. She has been a co-recipient of award from UKERI, UK on pioneering iron and steel metallurgy, AHRC UK on interfaces between archaeology and drama, SSHRC Canada, Royal Society, National Science Foundation, and other international bodies. She is first author of the book India's Legendary Wood Steel and contributing author to Ecstasy of Classical Art, the Bronze Catalogue of National Museum, Delhi, and co-editor of Digital Hampi on digital explorations into the art and architecture of Hampi. She is on the standing committee of the International Beginning of the Use of Metals and Alloys Conference. She has also been an accomplished exponent of the classical dance from the Bharatnatyam and has given numerous lecture demonstrations such as on the artistic and scientific perspectives on the Chola Nataraja bronze at international museums such as Royal Academy of Arts, London, 2007, and with a photo exhibition on the theme at Space City in 2009, apart from national venues. She has earned her PhD from the Institute of Archaeology, University College London, 1996, on archaeometallurgy of South Indian bronzes, MA from School of Oriental and African Studies, London in 1999, and BTech in Engineering Physics from IIT Bombay in 1987. So we have such a brilliant speaker with us today. So I once again welcome Professor Sharada Srinivasan.
Thank you so much, sir, for that very kind and very elaborate introduction. And it's very inspiring also for me as an IIT alumnus to be here with so many of you from the IIT family to be talking on this very important topic. Shall I stop my video or shall I keep it going, the video?
I think that's okay. uh,
Okay,
because
the video can be there on the
yeah,
side, is
all
it?
other participants have
Yeah.
actually
Okay.
muted their videos.
Ma'am, but sir, sometimes the voice breaks because of the bandwidth.
Okay,
So if
okay, fine, fine.
Okay, okay. So now that we've been able to greet each other, let me just say that it's a big pleasure to be on this program, and namaste. And I'm very pleased to be part of this prestigious scheme. Thank you very much to all of you in AICT for this very kind invitation, and my greetings and best wishes to all our participants, and look forward to keeping in communications on these topics. So, of course, the topic of Indian metallurgical traditions is really quite vast. So, you know, it's obviously one cannot comprehensively cover all of this, but perhaps I'll try and you know, bring up some case studies which can give us some insights into you know, the nuances of the topic and the challenges, and also the ways of perhaps finding a lot of my work has been about finding bridges, let's say. And so in this case, there is also the bridge between the past and the present, the traditional knowledge and modern metallurgical or modern science and teaching, and integrating also art and science. And I think it's very important we have this dialogue and this initiative, because I remember many years ago when I was an undergraduate at IIT. I mean, our work and our options were so super specialized. You know, we did either quantum physics, or we did electrical engineering, or we did this or that. So we you know, it was a bit compartmentalized. So we were not really able to get that kind of holistic picture, which in a way is really what I think we are coming back to this idea. And as I think Michelle Danino also mentioned, the need for sustainability as well, which this vision entails. Um, Now, what is happening? Yeah, okay. So what I'll be trying to touch upon is, you know, how we maybe we could communicate to, you know, the larger student body and so on. You know, the place of course, history of science and technology more broadly, but also the history of metallurgy in terms of understanding the march of civilization. And in this respect, the subject area that I'm going to talk about, which is to do with metallurgical heritage. So it is part of this sub-discipline, which really falls into the domain of archaeology and archaeological sciences, which is described as archaeometallurgy and archaeomaterials research, which is broadly a term which describes, you know, the study of the practice of metallurgy in a historical context, and from the archaeological remains, and also looking perhaps at artisanal technologies and what we may learn from them to understand these facets of history of technology and so on. So when we look at the pedagogic approaches in terms of history of science and history of technology and history of metallurgy, some of the significant questions that come to mind are broadly, what are the major metals and alloys which were used in antiquity? And how did their study contribute to the progressive development of modern metallurgy and the history of science and technology? And of course, the important question for us is to the highlights of Indian contributions and significance to history of technology and history of art and so on. Of course, that's a very broad field, and I'm sure further research and so on, both from archaeological perspectives and scientific perspectives and our historical and art historical perspectives will keep throwing new light. But anyway, and what I also wanted to perhaps mention here, because I saw that Professor Anil Sahasrabuddhe was a convener of AICT, and actually I have a long association with him because he was a close colleague of my uncle, late Professor C.V. Seshadri, who used to teach at IIT Kanpur. And I remember that they were all part of this larger, what used to be called the People's Science Movement in those days, which was really trying to look at, of course, my uncle worked mainly in the area of appropriate technology for rural areas after he moved from IIT Kanpur. And So he had written a little respectability for traditional technologies and traditional practitioners, and that should be part of a larger development paradigm and so on. Of course, he passed away in 1995, but I met Professor Sahasrabudhe again. In 2017 when we had a memorial after many years, a memorial seminar for late Professor C.V. Seshadri, which took place at IIT Madras and involved a lot of institutions. And so one of the points that he had tried to make was that often when we look at modern parameters of science and technology, then a lot of the traditional crafts and technologies are designated as inefficient because there's a lot of the hand labor and so on. But in their own way, I think that poses a conundrum, and that reduces the value of hand labor and so on. So these were some of the kind of discussions about all of this, which is still relevant even today. Of course, so when we look at the progress of the use of metals in antiquity, so I mean, of course, early humankind had a fascination for metals, which of course was for making various utilitarian artifacts such as weapons and tools, but also from quite early on in terms of the decorative, ritual and symbolic aspects and so on. And it's also quite interesting that the progression in metals and alloys has also in a way quite closely mirrored the march of civilization and has contributed in many ways to laying the foundations of what we call modern science and technology. So that's why it's relevant to understand the usage of metals and so on, going back to early prehistory. And it's also, of course, when we look at the amount of metals or materials which were known in the pre-industrial time, that number is actually quite small, but it's really from the Industrial Revolution that there's this exponential growth in terms of the metals and the materials synthesized and so on, and that's been growing in an exponential way. And there have a lot of the seeds are there in ancient traditional practices, and to some extent also in terms of as I will point out, some of the important contributions from the Indian subcontinent in these terms. So of course, the classification of the use of metals and alloys in a way was one that had been laid down by C.J. Thompson in the early 19th century, where he talked about the stages of the Paleolithic and the Neolithic and so on in prehistory. And then moving on to the use of metals. And that went from the use of metals which were more easy to locate and identify and use and process to the more complicated ones with the understanding and emergence of smelting technologies and so on. And so in that sense, and going from the metals and alloys which were more easier to make to those which were more complicated to extract and so on. So in that sense, the metal ages which are divided into the Copper Age and then the Bronze Age and then the Iron Age, because copper was easier to access, which was also available very early on in the native state. And then moving on to the alloys where tin was used to harden bronze and hence used to make weapons and so on. And then, of course, smelting iron that made for better weapons and so on. And so I think, moved from the native metal to those which could be smelted more easily from ores, and those which were then finally more difficult to smelt. And so there are about, I would say about 8 metals in antiquity, which are, which were used quite widely, or at least leading up to the pre-industrial period, which include gold, silver, copper, iron, tin, lead, zinc, and mercury, and so on. And the Indian subcontinent, like several other civilizations, has also made very major contributions, particularly in some. Now, the noble metals like gold and silver, of course, are found in the native state. And so those were used from quite early on to make jewelry and hammered into sheet metal and so on, due to the great ductility and luster of the pure gold. And also gold was also retrieved from the riverbeds known as alluvial gold. And I just put this in because this is perhaps the most spectacular early gold artifact that is known in the world, the mask of the pharaoh Tutankhamun from Egypt. And you see that there was a use of a range of metals and materials here, including bitumen and copper and precious stones and so on and the other. And it's also interesting that though we talk of these different ages like copper, bronze, and iron and so on, so all civilizations did not uniformly go through all the different ages that we're talking about. For example, the South Americans and the Incas and the Aztecs and so on, they used a lot of gold, very spectacular gold artifacts for which those were greatly sought after by the Spanish conquerors and so on. And they were extensively hammering and shaping and so on with gold, but they never moved on to the use of iron at all. So they never moved into the age of iron. So and although they're called the New World, in a way, it's in the Old World that, which is the rest of the world really, that a lot of the advances in metals and materials were made, though the Incas had. In fact, the South Americans also used noble metal as platinum, but they somehow didn't go on to actually the extraction of metals like iron and so on. So, of course, when we come to the Indian subcontinent, well, here I'm only going to be talking about case studies and not everything exhaustively because, you know, one can just go on and there's only so much one can cover in the time. But of course, the Harappan sites, you do find use of gold, such as Mohenjo-daro, Mandi, Dholavira, and so on. And these use the sheet-hammered artifacts and gold headbands and so on. And there's also knowledge of repoussé and gold beads and so on. And when we look at the, for instance, the priest king from Mohenjo-daro, you see that headband, which was very likely something which was made of a strip of gold like this, which is of repoussé work and such like. So when we come to actually, I talked about the alluvial gold, which is extracted by panning in the rivers, because what really happens is that, as you would know from the knowledge of, you know, ores and so on, a lot of the mountains have the ore bodies and the veins, you know, which go up the mountain slope. And then, and then what happens is that with the washing down from the rains and things like that, the metals such as gold and so on is washed down to the lower reaches into the river valleys and so on. So that's what alluvial gold is and so on. So a lot of the early gold was perhaps alluvial gold, but also of course, in Karnataka, there is a lot of evidence for very early gold mines. And this region in the Hatti-Maski region, and I've done some field work there. So there are quite a lot of extensive old gold workings and so on. So you're looking at one of the shafts going deep down. And a lot of these veins are of auriferous quartz. And there's also a rock edict of Ashoka in the Maski region. And this region was also referred to as Suvarna, to the fact that there was the gold there had been, you know, was known to have been exploited and so on. And of course, the fame of jewelry and gold and so on from India was one of the reasons why from early on you had a lot of, the gemstones and so on, the gemstone trade and such like attracted the Romans in the early Christian era and so on. So India was always fabled to be the land of gemstones and gold and such like. Now we move on to copper, which is of course, copper, gold and silver and all are very soft metals and ductile metals. And copper also, of course, is found in the native state, which means that it is unalloyed or in the natural form. And some of the places where you get very abundant reserves of native copper is actually in the Great Lakes region in North America. And so there the North American Indians used to make weapons and implements and such like solely by hammering and annealing this native copper, and they did not again move on to casting and smelting and such like. And so, and then of course, copper also occurs naturally as oxide in ores. And so in later periods, they would have discovered the use of and the techniques of smelting copper oxides and so on. And this is just to show you a photograph of an old copper working in the Ingaldhal region in Karnataka. So you can see here the malachite ores, which are basically copper carbonate ores. And of course, you also find the cuprite ores, but quite abundant are the malachite and the carbonate ores. And in the deeper reaches, as you go down the veins and all, you find the sulfidic ores and the chalcopyrite ores and such like. And of course, there's also extensive evidence for copper mining and so on in the Khetri region in Rajasthan, for example, which had extensive copper mines which had been worked in antiquity and so on. But this is anyway just to show you in Ingaldal, this open cast excavation with these malachite traces and remnants. And so just to begin by, to give you an idea of what we actually do as an archaeometallurgist, one part of it is to try and retrieve the evidence on the ancient, well, the processes of smelting and metal extraction and so on. And so we try and retrieve this knowledge by actually looking at the debris from the archaeometallurgical processes. As I had shown you, that was an open cast mine. And so these were some, so around this old working of Ingaldal, I had done some surveys and found some metallurgical slags. So slags are basically the debris from the smelting process, because the heavier metal ingot sinks to the bottom of the furnace, and then the slag, which is floating on the top, is tapped out. And so that is really basically what is left behind, because then the metal is taken away. So when we study the slag, there are still some remnants of the metal, which give an idea of how the metal was processed and so on. So the study and survey of slags is also quite important in that sense. And this is also one of the problems we face also in the study of history of technology and so on, because nobody really documents or appreciates the significance of studying these archaeometallurgic slags and debris, and many slags just get used for construction and various other things. So these are all the various kinds of challenges to save some of these sites and some of this evidence in the first place. And of course, this was a site where I found some Shatavahan era pottery as well, early historic Shatavahan era pottery. And so just to typically give you an idea of what this is, tap slag, copper tap slag. And so when you actually look at the microstructure, which is basically you make a section of the slag and then you polish it like you would a metallographic specimen. And then when you look at it, then you get certain information which tells you how the processing techniques may have been. And here you can see what is actually what we describe as a prill, which is basically a solidified droplet of molten metal, which is trapped in the slag. And so in this case, the copper has separated out into this, this metallic portion. And you can see it is also quite smelting. So already it was quite a sophisticated process of smelting, because you can see the sulfide ring all around this prill specimen. So this is actually from smelting a copper sulfide. Anyway, so these are just to give you some examples. And of course, then we move on to tin and bronze. Now, tin ore also occurs as alluvial deposits, and it was alloyed to copper to get bronze to make weapons and so on in the Bronze Age cultures. And of course, we all know this image very well from Mohenjo-daro and the Harappan civilization, which was a Bronze Age civilization. And you see that this is this very well executed little statue of the dancing girl. And what you're looking at this side is actually excavation which was going on in Dholavira, which I participated in now, I think back in 2003. This was in fact just struck me when I was there is that, you know, the dancing girl, she wears this armful of bangles, you know, shell bangles, and you still see that being practiced by many people in Kutch and so on. You know, so there are so many of these aspects of continuities which still carry on in so many of aspects of visual representation. These are, of course, the Rabari tribal women and so on in Kutch. So a lot of my study actually was on the celebrated Nataraja bronze, but perhaps in this study, I won't delve into it so much, the studies in the Chola bronze, because that involves a lot of art historical and other information. So I thought I would stick more to the aspects which could be relevant to overall, you know, insights about Indian metallurgical traditions. But anyway, so this is a cell, and so a lot of my work had been to actually try and do the technical analysis also of the Chola bronzes, and then to combine that with the study of the chemical composition to get a better understanding of the chronology and so on, because there are a lot of problems, as you may be aware, in terms of authenticity of art objects, and especially, for instance, with the Chola bronzes and so on, because many of these are continuing traditions, and even today there are a lot of bronzes being cast in traditional workshops, and so there's a lot of confusion also between what are authentic pieces and what are antiques and what are later copies and such like. But the Nataraja bronze of depiction of the Hindu god Shiva is a lot of dance. This is from Kankodu Vanithavan in the Chennai Museum, circa 1040 AD. And this is a very remarkable. The seminal essays on the Chola bronze and the Nataraja was by Ananda Kumaraswamy in 1912, where he described the image as poetry, but nonetheless science. And, you know, from texts such as the Unmai Vilakam and so on, he talks about how this image, you know, described the Panchakritya, or the 5 activities of the dance of Shiva, which include Shrishti or creation, Samhara or destruction, and of course creation is depicted by the drum in one hand, and Samhara by the fire in the other hand, and the demon Apasmara of ignorance is under Shiva's foot, and the lifted leg held aloft gives release, and that's what he described as poetry, but nonetheless science. And you have all the Prabhavali all around, which in a way represents these cosmic cycles, we would say, of creation and destruction. Those are some interpretations from some of the later 13th century Shaiva Siddhanta texts, although they may have been different ways of visualizing this icon and so on. So the technique that I had used for analysis is what is typically called spectrochemical analysis, where I had undertaken, and that time, of course, a lot of our problem in archaeometallurgy is to get samples, because it's not very easy often to get samples. So that itself is a challenge, persuading museums to give samples. And of course, micro sampling and so on, so that you don't actually damage the archaeological artifact. So the technique that I had used for analysis was spectrochemical analysis, which is basically using micro drilling of some of the drillings of using a drill bit of no more than about, say, 1 millimeter or something, and then subjecting that to in that circumstance, I'd used inductively coupled plasma optical emission spectroscopy. And that was found to be typically a leaded bronze of about 8% tin and 8% lead. And so basically, by the addition of lead was because it was making bronze more castable. As I said, tin was added to harden bronze, but you needed the addition of lead also to make. And I mean, since I mentioned Ananda Kumar Swami, I should say that he was also one of those who was very concerned about the craftspeople. He wrote a lot on that and also talked about the need to invigorate the crafts and so on. And speaking of the crafts, of course, there are the traditions of bronze casting still survive in places such as Swami Malay in Tanjavur district. And so this still follows a traditional method which can be described as, which is still described as Madhu Chahiste Vidhana in Sanskrit, which is mentioned in the Shilpa Shastras, which basically means, which translates as Madhu is honey, and Chahiste Vidhana is, it's basically describes the lost wax technique, which is also known as investment casting in the modern metallurgical parlance, where basically, I mean, when you cast, you typically pour a liquid metal into a mold and then it solidifies into the shape of the object to be cast. But the lost wax casting technique is typically one where you first have a wax model which is built, and then a clay casing is built around it, and then it is fired. And so then the wax melts out and the negative impression becomes the mold. And then the metal is poured into that hollow mold. One sec, sorry, just need to drink a bit of water. And then the image is finished and polished and so on. And so this tradition, of course, continues very much in places such as Swami Malay. And although, of course, every time I go, I find that some of the traditional hand methods are giving way to just like more industrialization, which is perhaps good for the craftspeople because it is a bit of drudgery. But even so, I mean, to a large extent, of course, you know, that you find that they're not using protective gear, and also it has its own hazards, but it, you know, they have so much of dedication and precision in what they do that this is really, you know, what consumes their life. So it's important to document. Now, I had mentioned the use of bronze, of course. Now I thought I'll just show you the copper tin phase diagram so you get a better sense of what are all the kinds of alloys we're talking about. So what, I don't know how many of you are actually metallurgists in this group because we weren't told about the composition, but I'm assuming that there may be some of you who are not metallurgists. So basically a phase diagram is one where you show with increasing amounts of one element being an alloy in the other, what are the type of outcomes in terms of what are the kinds of phases which could form and so on. And those phases are also reflected in the microstructure. So it helps us to actually correlate from the microstructure what may be the composition and so on. So when we talk about bronzes, I did talk about the Chola bronzes being of leaded tin bronze, where of course the tin content was not very high in that sense because as I mentioned, tin, when we add it to bronze, it does harden it. But if you add too much tin, then bronze also becomes very brittle. But what is also interesting is that already in the Indian subcontinent, you also see the use of bronzes with a higher tin content, interesting phases, such as the delta and the beta phase. And I'll just give some examples of that. If you see that the beta phase, I don't know if you know what the beta is the Greek alphabet there, you can see, which looks like a B. So you see that there's one, just look at that window because I'll bring you back, I'll be discussing it. You'll see that around about 23% tin, within this temperature range of about 600 to 700 degrees, you find this predominant formation of this beta phase. And there's another phase, which of course I'll maybe come back to that. So when you keep that in mind, it's very interesting that some of these vessels that I'm going to talk about were really made by optimizing the presence and properties of this beta phase, which forms at about 23% tin content. So what you're looking at here is actually a vessel of this beta bronze, 23% tin bronze. Now, why that's quite significant was, as I was saying, if you keep on adding tin to copper, it becomes very brittle. But this is quite a rare alloy because at 23% tin bronze, if it was allowed to slow cool, then yes, it would become very brittle. But when they quenched this bronze, and the reason for aiming for this property for this composition of 23% in bronze was that it could be forged very highly, much more than lower till bronze, because the beta has got some plastic properties. So it could actually be forged very heavily. And then when they quenched it, they retained this 23% tin bronze beta phase primarily. And so that had some very useful properties because it could make very beautiful hot forged and quenched vessels, which also had some other properties because the beta phase was more prominent. So I think it also contributed to some level of corrosion resistance, and maybe that's why it was useful for vessels. And these were used very widely, not just in South India, but in other parts of India as well, though this tradition has very markedly declined now. And I was also able to make that connection to very long-standing practices by some studies that I made at the workshops of some Kamalar, which is the traditional communities in Kerala and so on, where they still make these, they still made these and so on from beta bronze, though I have to say that's more or less declined now, but these were some documentations that I made in the 90s, and it continued for a bit into the 2000s, but very much declining, I would say. And so this is an object from the Nilgiri cairns, which was made in that fashion. And that was not the only, skilled use of bronze of a higher tin content. And we also find that bronze of a high tin content was used to make mirrors. And of course, mirrors were made in different parts of the old world, including India and China and so on. But perhaps the mirrors that were made, this particular mirror making technique, which survives in Aranmula, is quite distinctive because it is they have managed to maybe optimize the composition again of this very specular alloy, which contained about 33% in bronze and which had this very silvery color. And it has very good reflectivity also. It's almost as good as a modern mirror. When you look at this mirror, the image that you see is really very clear and very good. And it's also a point image because if you see the modern glass mirrors, then they have glass with a coating of mercury and so on. So there is a bit of refraction through the glass, where here it was the point mirror really. And I also think the Aranmula mirror composition is slightly different from the kinds of mirrors you find in China and Rome. And it really optimizes this specular alloy content, which I'll talk about in a minute. And I'll just come back to this phase diagram. And as you see, when you go past 30% in, you come to about 32% in, you see another of the Greek alphabet delta. So this delta, and actually the delta is that compound which is very silvery. And normally the delta actually embrittles the bronze. But here, the fact that delta is a very silvery, white and hard compound, by optimizing the presence of that delta phase, and then by polishing that alloy so well, that's how you get that very good mirrory, silvery mirror effect. And this delta phase had a hardness of about 500 VPN, which is very high hardness, almost as good as normalized steel and such like. And so this is a tradition which is still preserved by these traditional acharyas in this region of Aranmula. So I'm not going too much into all the craft traditions because I find, I have quite a lot of ground still to cover, probably another 20 minutes anyway. But this was a late master craftsman, Janardhan Acharya, whom I had also visited again in 1998. So it's interesting because you could say that using very traditional materials, they managed to get a rather high-tech end product. And they used rather skilled casting processes. And on the top of it there, you see this photomicrograph, which is basically you take a specimen and you polish it and do metallographic study. And that shows you again this silvery color of the delta phase, which is what gives this mirror effect and so on. And some of these studies of mine have also been published in the Encyclopedia of Non-Western Science. And of course, just to point out that the use of mirrors, you also see quite a lot of sculptures in the Indian context depicting mirrors and such like. This is the celebrated um, sculpture of Madanika in Belur holding a mirror and such like. So, and then the mirror as a part of the adornment of the woman, of course, and the upsea and such like. So now I move on to zinc metal, which is a very important story really, because the earliest firm evidence for the production of metallic zinc is from India. And in fact, zinc is one of the most difficult metals to smelt, because zinc volatilizes at about the same temperature of around 1000 degrees that is needed to actually smelt the zinc ore, which means that it sublimates. It goes directly from the solid state to the vapor phase. So it's not very easy to extract zinc in the liquid phase. However, there is extensive evidence that production of metallic zinc in the Zawar area of Rajasthan, which the remains have been dated, especially by the work of particularly Paul Craddock of the British Museum has done a lot of work on zinc smelting and also published a very comprehensive monograph on that, which those of you interested might like to read. And so these are some zinc smelting furnaces at Zawar, and this tradition was also awarded the International ASM landmark in 1988 for the remains of the zinc smelting processes. Now, the ASM landmark is an American landmark system where many important monuments like the Eiffel Tower and the Iron Bridge in the UK and so on are also ASM landmarks. So this is, of course, a great recognition of the early tradition of zinc smelting in India and Rajasthan and so on. And just to explain basically what this method of production of zinc metal was. Now, it is also interesting that the 12th century Sanskrit text of the Rasaratna Samuchaya describes this process of zinc production, and it is also described as Tiryak Patana, or downward distillation, where what was done is, as I said, the problem, of course, of isolating zinc in the metallic state was that, to prevent the sublimation. So this was done by a process of downward distillation with suitably designed retorts and condensers and furnaces and so on. And it's also interesting that in Europe, of course, though they did use brass very extensively, it was made by a different process of coarse smelting copper ores and zinc ores and so on. But they didn't actually know how to extract metallic zinc until William Champion suddenly first established commercial and industrial zinc smelting operations in Bristol in the 1740s. And of course, now some of the scholars such as Craddock and others have argued that William Champion, at the time of the forays of the East India Company and so on into India and such like, that he obviously had knowledge of the Zawar process from the remains and so on. So this process that he had sort of invented or whatever was very much inspired by the Indian process, and I think that's also generally acknowledged as a case of transfer of technology from India to the West, so to speak. And this is just to show the kind of the retorts and the furnace. So you see how to the bottom of the furnace using this furnace which is heated from the top. The retort is sort of goes through these percolated furnaces and such like. Of course, another innovation which one could credit Indian metal workers, which is quite distinct in terms of the use of a high zinc alloy, was of the Bidri ware, which was also flourished in the Bidar province under some of the Deccan Sultanates, from about the 14th century, where it is basically a high zinc alloy, which is got also a bit of copper alloy in it, and then it is inlaid with silver, and then it is etched and such like to bring out this beautiful patination. And there are a lot of geometrical and floral patterns, and some of these are, of course, the motifs and so on are also inspired by Persian metalworking techniques, which used a lot of inlays and things like that. So there was also this syncretism of bringing together maybe a technology that was developed in India and then with some of the Persian metalworking techniques. So that is, and that craft also, of course, survives, but like all others is, express sort of faces vicissitudes of time and such like. Now I think, yes, I still have to come to have another 10, 15 minutes, I think. Yes. So I'll now move over to the question of iron and steel, which iron, of course, is another metal which iron actually does not occur in its own right in the native state on Earth. But the only example of native iron is really as meteoric iron, where the meteoric showers also had a bit of. So it's in a way it's a meteoric iron is a cosmic metal, so to speak. And interestingly, meteoric iron was also exploited. For example, the North American Indians, you find that they did have weapons of iron and so on, but this is meteoric iron and not smelted iron that they were using to make these weapons and so on. And of course, one of the reasons that, iron also has quite a high melting point, and that's why, so this has a melting point of about 1500 degrees centigrade. So it was actually produced in the old world basically by reducing the ore to the metal in the solid state to produce bloomery iron. And this took place then eventually in several parts in Europe and Asia and India and Africa as well. And but what is of significance also
Ma'am, your voice is not coming. You have muted yourself.
Oh, I see. Okay, now can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Right now we can.
And have you lost the screen or is that there?
Yes, ma'am. No, ma'am. We are unable to see your screen.
Okay, okay. Yeah, I think it was, I don't know. Okay, fine. Yeah. So I've come back to the screen now. Yeah, I'll just close this one. No, but this, if I close, it says something else. This is a little bit in the way now, this icon. I don't know what to do. Okay, fine. Yeah. Right. I think, oops. Can you see the screen now? Yeah.
No, ma'am.
Huh? Okay, I'll do share
No,
screen.
ma'am.
Okay, I'll do share screen again. But you can hear me?
Yes, ma'am. We can hear you, but we are unable to see your screen.
Oh, actually,
screen has also come.
Now I can see the screen quite well. Can you see it?
Screen has come now.
Screen has come. Okay, okay.
Yes. Yes.
Right. So yeah, so I'll carry on then. Can wait a minute now. This seems to be a little stuck on. Is it moving the screen? Is my screen moving? Is my screen moving? Yeah, resume slideshow, right? Is it seeing now? Can you see this now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, okay. Right. So now I come to the Delhi Iron Pillar, of course, which is the most celebrated metallic artifact in a way from the Indian subcontinent, which of course I'm sure needs no introduction to most people. And so the Delhi Iron Pillar, of course, this stands testimony to the skills in forging of wrought iron, which seems to have reached its zenith in India in the first millennium. And this is the earliest massive forging, and it is which is known in the world, at least the surviving, largest surviving massive forging. And it is dated by inscription to the Gupta period of the 4th century CE. And of course, stands at a height of about 7 meters and weight of 6 tons. And it is thought to have been made by forging together a series of disc-shaped looms. And it's also interesting in terms of history and science of technology that one of the pillar was Sir Robert Hatfield in 1912. And he also went on to develop the Hatfield steel, which had 13% manganese, and which also, was a big contribution towards the Industrial Revolution and so on. And he was one of the first people actually to study the Delhi Iron Pillar, and probably it was one of the first archaeological metal specimens to be analyzed and published and brought to the attention of modern metallurgists. And making traditions is also touched upon by Vincent Ball in 1881, who writes that it has not many have been an impossibility in the largest foundries of the world. And also this pillar has also been given an ASM International Landmark Award by the Materials Information Society. And this plaque was, and some of us at NIAS were also responsible in putting this landmark up for recognition. And that's also important to get some of these sites related to historical science and technology also to the attention of bodies in terms of listing and scientific heritage or cultural heritage and so on. Because then at least it has a certain value addition in that way. And they also comment here that the rustless metallurgical marvel dedicated to ancient iron making today
Ma'am, please unmute your mic.
is going off every now and then. Okay, so yeah, sorry. Yeah, So I think I'll just quickly run through because I don't know, there seems to be some imbalance in my. So now we come to I'll go on to the woods making tradition because India has also been very well known for making the high carbon steel, which was described as woods because many of the European travelers who encountered, this steel, which was known as ukku in the traditional languages in Karnataka and Andhra Pradesh and so on. So they described that as woods. And this is basically what we may describe as a cake of woods. So I come back to the iron carbon phase diagram now because this will help us to understand what we are talking about. Now, when we talk about wrought iron, of course, that has a carbon content of below 0.04% carbon. And pearlitic steels and normal steels and so on, they have slightly more carbon in them. And of course, it's the carbon in the iron that causes some of the hardening, and the properties that you find in steel. And cast iron, of course, has a composition of about 4% carbon. And cast iron was something which the Chinese had mastered much earlier than other cultures. But what was the speciality of woods was that it had a composition of about between 1 to 2% carbon, and it Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am, we can hear you, but your voice is breaking a little bit.
Okay, fine. Okay, I'll try to speak, at least show the slides quickly. So the process of making woods, for example, was observed by Francis Buchanan in, the crucible steel making process in Mysore just after the fall of Tipu in 1799. So basically, the process described as the Mysore process was that they packed the steel, they packed the wrought iron inside these crucibles and carburized it to, so that more of to get this high carbon steel. And this was typically the kind of furnace that he observed where it was packed for long firing cycles and probably operated by somebody using bag bellows. This, of course, is a conjectural sketch that we have made. And of course, the term woods, rukku or egu also finds itself, finds some mention also it's an old Tamil word, and you also find some usage in Tamil text. For instance, egu refers to spears. And you also have the poetry of the Sangamira by the Tamil poetess Avayar, of about, say, 100 BC or the first century AD or so, which also referred to, the use of the spears in the battles by chieftains and all that which she was observing. And the term ukku or urukku is also popular parlance, you sometimes hear that being used or occurs. So it refers to the melting process and so on. So it could relate to this idea of, packing material into a crucible and heating it to long firing cycles, which basically is what this carburization towards high carbon steel could be referring to. And this is to give you a look at what the microstructure of woods. This is a fragment that I analyzed of an iron nail from Pattinam in Kerala. So you can see typically here, you see this matrix of perlite inside, network of cementite. And so this dark perlite and, cementite, light cementite, you also keep that in mind because that is also one of the important attractions of this wood steel. And then you see that this is a typical hypereutectoid structure of wood steel. And this was also something which I had published in the INSA journal. And so basically it was that wood ingot which was forged very heavily, which became famous as this watered silk pattern. And many of these forged ingots of Damascus steel were actually exported also to Persia and the Middle East and the Arab world and so on. And they were forged very extensively. And such Damascus blades you also find a lot in the Indian armories, such as across India, where there is Mughal or Rajput armories, Maratha, and Tipu's armories, and so on. And another interesting aspect in terms of history of metallurgy is that this Damascus, also quite a lot of Damascus, it was one of the first items that was actually studied under the microscope, as pointed out by Cyril Stanley Smith, who's one of the great historians of science. And this was also because you could see this very clear difference in structures and so on. So it was one of the easy structures to be first examined under the microscope. And the interest in that study of the Damascus blade also led to a lot of innovations in material science. And even leading figures such as Michael Faraday attempted to replicate the wood steel. And there was a whole body of European scientists and metallurgists who tried Hello? Hello?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Anyway, I'm almost finished. So I think there's only one or two. I was going to show the, some of the experimental smelting of iron and just one or two slides on that. And that it's important to connect with the traditional artisans. And I think there was a slide of the Agaria furnace as well, but I'm not able to, let me see, am I able to move this? Yeah, that's right. So of course, we know that there's a lot, some of the traditional knowledge, such as of iron smelting, which is still practiced by the Agarias and Asurs and so on in central India and Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh, and problem of the marginalization of crafts and how to also, well, document these to some extent, but also to provide some value addition for them, because we find there's a complete disconnect in the way we are taught metallurgy and so on, that we don't really, it's all become very theoretical and perhaps more and more lab based or in fact now most of the metals are also simulated on a computer, so there's even less of the practical work than even perhaps when we were younger. But so I think there's a certain sense of excitement in having hands-on practical work, even in simple things like traditional iron smelting and making and so on. So this is a traditional Lagaria furnace which we try to build, and it's nice to get your hands messy and get students and so on involved in building the furnace and the clays. And this way you also learn about the parameters, in a rather experiential way. Of course, you have to make sure that the safety and so on is also maintained. And we also actually try to involve the local blacksmiths, because you find that, of course, in many parts of India, of course, blacksmiths now are just went into, making the iron that they're working and so on. So it's also important for value addition for the craftspeople to enhance their understanding, their, of course, their understanding mainly empirical. So on one level to understand, their knowledge and but also to enhance their knowledge, to also get them to appreciate some of the scientific aspects and the facets and so on, so they can also engage more meaningfully. And I'm pleased to say that one of the postdocs we also had at NIAS himself comes from a Vishwakarma or a traditional crafts community, Dr. Uday, who then is now taking a lot of interest in these iron smelting experiments and so on. So it's important to also engage with the communities of artisans, the learning opportunities all around. So thank you very much. And in summary, of course, Indian subcontinent was home to several skilled practices of traditional mining, metal processing. And although several of the traditional skills have greatly declined, with artisans facing increasing marginalization in an era of industrialization and globalization, this is also a time when we should try and re-engage and, re-energize in these directions to keep some of this legacy going, and to also look at the relevance in modern times and so on. So thank you very much for this opportunity. Should I do the stop share now?
Yes, ma'am. Hello. Ma'am, can we take some questions?
Yeah, so I've done the stop share. Yeah.
Ma'am, a couple of hands are raised. Can we take some questions?
Yes. Can you tell me how I should take the questions? I mean, in this
as we are talking, in the similar way.
Achha, they will talk, right? Yeah, because I can't read any questions. Yeah, okay.
In voice mode.
And if there are any relevant slide that the question is about, you can certainly share again and show that slide also.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, yeah.
Dr. Sunil Kumar Goyal ji, you can ask your question. You can kindly unmute your mic and ask. Professor Neil Shah, sir. Professor Neil Shah, sir, if you can hear us, kindly unmute your mic and ask the question. Dr. Sunil Kumar Goyal ji.
If someone from our panelists also want to ask something from ma'am, they can ask. And if any participants has any questions, kindly raise your hand. We will provide the mic and then you can ask any question from the ma'am. Professor Rajat.
Namaste. Thanks for the wonderful lecture. You spoke about the iron pillar at Delhi. We are told that there is also a similar iron pillar at Dhar in Madhya Pradesh. So have you got a chance to look at that? And we are also told that that has been split up into 3 or 4 parts and it is lying there. I just wanted to know if you have got a chance to look at that one.
Yeah. Can you all just speak a little slower? Yeah. So you were asking about the iron pillar at Dhar. Yes. Now, actually, yes, there is the iron pillar at Dhar. There's also one at Kodachadri. Now, the iron pillar at Dhar, late Professor Balasubramaniam, he had also collaborated with me. He managed to get a sample, and it is actually a published. I've also published that, with his collaboration in an article that we wrote for World of Iron, and that also had a fairly similar microstructure to the Delhi iron pillar in terms of the, seeing the significant trace of phosphorus. I won't say it's very high, but it's a significant trace, and also the slag which is sort of spread through. So, but of course, getting access to all of these things is not that easy. So, some more contemporary studies could be done if we had better access. But anyway, that is always a problem. But yes, thank you for mentioning that. There is also that. And of course, there's also the famous iron beams at Konarak and so on. So yes, that's a vast topic in itself. In the future, I would like to revisit that.
Hello.
Yes.
Hello, can I ask now?
Yes, please.
Ma'am, I'm Archana Saxena from SKIT Jaipur. I want to ask one question from you. And this is about the metallurgy of gold. How old is the history of metallurgy of gold? Because it is evident from our, religious literature that it is offered to gods. All the gods are heavily decorated with the jewelry of gold. So how old is the history of metallurgy of gold?
Yeah.
Please state something about it.
Yeah, so I think I did cover that gold is one of the very early metals to have been used across the world. And, you have finds even in, of course, Egypt, you have a very spectacular early gold, but also even in Bulgaria, you find very rich gold going back to about, I think, the 4th millennium BC or so. And then, in the Harappan context, you do start seeing it from definitely the mature Harappan. You find, as I was saying, the gold bands and so on. That is about 3000 BC or 2500 BC. So it is then used in specifically these cultures to quite an extent. And you also find these remarkable, those really, I mean, if you've seen those gold beads at Dholavira, they're so tiny. The way they were able to make, miniature faceted gold is really quite amazing. And then you again start finding gold artifacts also from the early historic period in various parts of India. Also, the Nilgiris had some early gold going back to the first millennium BCE. So then you do find again, but one of the problems also with the Indian context is things like gold have been reused so much. As we know, in the family heirlooms also the tradition is to remelt, or they cut it up and they recast. And also, I think if you look at all those spectacular sculptures and so on, there would have been so much more of gold and so on which was being used across India, but a lot has. And of course, it was also one of those booties. So every time there was, war booty and things like that, it was gold and gems and all, which people were coming for as well. So, but yeah, so I did cover it. So I think, and of course, as far as the dates are concerned for the Hatti Musky region, there were some carbon dates by work by Curtis. So that did say those particular mines, the hard rock mining, is about 4th century BC. But the placer mining of gold, which is the alluvial mining, it won't actually leave traces, because once you collect the gold, you don't find the traces in that sense to make it very datable. But the artifacts, I suppose, are there to point to the dates and things like that. So thank you.
Thank you.
And of course, in the religious context, the Rig Veda, does talk about the Hiranya Garbha, which is actually a metaphor for the universe, which is a golden egg. So yes, it's very much part of the shapes so much of the religious ethos, not just in India, but in so many parts of the world, really. So gold has always had that connection, I think, this significance and ritual connection and so on. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Vivek bhaiya or Ruchir bhaiya?
Thank you, panelists, for giving me chance to ask the question again on this day.
Hello. Hello.
जी जी विवेक भैया बोलो.
Thank you, Professor Srinivasan. So now, can I request participants to go for one or two questions, because our next speaker is also waiting.
2-3 questions are or has been already done.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So now I must thank Professor Sharada Srinivasan for such a wonderful lecture today, and we will continue this work with AI. I hope that she would be readily agree to work with AICT in developing modules and continue this work. So thank you once again, ma'am.
Thank you. It's a wonderful opportunity, and thank you also to all the participants for their, for their attentive hearing and for the very interesting questions, and very, best to all of you. And take care as well. All